After a powerful earthquake splits open the ground near his home, a hiker uncovers a buried steel bunker hidden beneath his backyard. Hoping it's just an old war shelter, he ventures inside, but what he finds defies explanation. The bunker contains advanced technology, decades-old recordings of people who never existed, and a file with his own name written long before he was born. As he pieces together the truth, he realizes the bunker was part of a secret experiment involving time, memory, and identity, and that its discovery may have already set something unstoppable in motion. But what if everything he thought he knew about his own past was carefully constructed to lead him to this exact moment? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dr. Michael Harrison had spent 37 years believing he understood the ground beneath his feet. As a retired geologist who had surveyed half the mountain ranges in the Pacific Northwest, he thought he knew every secret the earth might hold. His modest two-story house sat on what he had always assumed was stable bedrock, a quarter-mile up the winding road from the small town of Cedar Falls, Washington. The property had been in his family for 2 generations, passed down from his grandfather, who had worked the lumber mills in the valley below. The earthquake struck at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in late September, a 6.2 magnitude tremor that lasted 43 seconds, and changed everything Michael thought he knew about his life. He had awakened to the violent shaking, his bed sliding across the hardwood floor as the house groaned and twisted around him. Picture frames crashed from the walls, and somewhere in the darkness, he heard the distinctive sound of his grandfather's antique china cabinet toppling over. When morning came and the aftershocks had settled into an uneasy quiet, Michael stepped out onto his back porch to assess the damage. The house had weathered the quake better than expected, but his backyard told a different story. A jagged crack ran diagonally across the lawn, splitting the earth like a massive zipper had been pulled open. The fissure was roughly 3 feet wide at its broadest, and extended from the old oak tree near his garden shed all the way to the edge of the forest that bordered his property. Michael had seen earthquake damage before. He knew that ground ruptures like this were common, that the earth often revealed its stress lines through such dramatic splits. What caught his attention, however, was not the crack itself, but what the crack had revealed. About 15 feet from his back steps, where the fissure ran deepest, he could see the unmistakable glint of metal beneath the disturbed soil. He spent the morning walking the perimeter of his property, noting the damage with the methodical eye of someone trained to read geological evidence. The old stone wall that separated his land from the Kowalski farm next door had shifted but held. The well pump house showed some settling, but nothing that couldn't be repaired. It was only when he returned to examine the mysterious metal protrusion more closely that his scientific curiosity overcame his caution. Armed with a flashlight and a small spade from his garden shed, Michael knelt beside the crack and began carefully clearing away the loose earth. What he initially took for a piece of old farm equipment, or perhaps a buried water tank, quickly revealed itself to be something far more intriguing. The metal was steel, thick and industrial, with a brushed finish that showed little sign of corrosion, despite having been underground for what appeared to be decades. As he cleared more soil away, the outline of a rectangular hatch became visible. It was approximately 4 feet square, set flush with what appeared to be a larger metal structure buried beneath his lawn. Heavy-duty hinges ran along one side, and in the center, a wheel lock mechanism, similar to what he had seen on old bank vaults or submarine doors. Michael sat back on his heels, wiping dirt from his hands as he tried to process what he was looking at. In all his years as a geologist, in all the surveys and excavations he had overseen, he had never encountered anything like this on residential property. The construction was clearly professional, built to last, and from the patina on the metal, it had been here long before his family had owned this land. His nearest neighbor, Elena Kowalski, arrived around noon with a casserole and genuine concern about the earthquake damage. Elena was 73, a retired nurse who had lived on the adjacent farm for over 40 years. She was also the closest thing Cedar Falls had to a local historian, someone who remembered the stories and gossip that had shaped the community over the decades. When Michael showed her the exposed hatch, Elena examined it with the careful attention of someone who had lived long enough to be surprised by very little. But when she looked up at him, there was genuine puzzlement in her expression. "I've never seen anything like this," she admitted, "and I thought I knew every story about this stretch of land. This had to have been built when the original homestead was here, before your grandfather bought the property in 1934. As the afternoon wore on, Michael found himself returning again and again to the hatch, knowing that tomorrow would bring a decision that would change everything. The locksmith Michael called the next morning was a weathered man named Frank Delacroix, who had been opening locks in the Pacific Northwest for over 30 years. Frank arrived in a battered pickup truck filled with tools that looked like they belonged in a museum. But his reputation for being able to open anything was legendary throughout the county. "You sure you own whatever's down there?" Frank asked, kneeling beside the hatch and running his fingers along the wheel lock mechanism. "Because this isn't your typical residential hardware. This is military grade, probably from the 1940s, and it's been maintained. Someone's been lubricating these seals." The comment sent a chill down Michael's spine. "What do you mean, maintained?" Frank pointed to several spots where the metal showed slight discoloration. "See these marks? This mechanism has been operated within the last few years. The lubricant on these threads is fresh, maybe 2 or 3 years old at most. Somebody's been coming down here." Michael looked around his property with new eyes. He had lived here for 15 years, ever since his retirement, and he was certain that no one had been accessing his backyard without his knowledge. The property was surrounded by forest on 3 sides, and the only approach was through his front yard or Elena's farm. Either someone had been incredibly careful, or there was another way in and out of whatever lay beneath his lawn. Frank worked for nearly an hour, using a combination of penetrating oil, heat from a small torch, and techniques that he declined to explain in detail. Finally, with a grinding sound that seemed to echo from deep underground, the wheel lock began to turn. "There we go," Frank said, sitting back on his heels as the mechanism disengaged. "But I'm telling you right now, Mr. Harrison, I don't like the feel of this. Something's not right about the whole setup." With Frank's help, Michael lifted the heavy steel hatch. It swung open on hinges that moved as smoothly as if they had been installed yesterday, revealing a set of metal stairs that descended into darkness. The air that rose from the opening was cool and sterile, carrying a faint chemical smell that reminded Michael of the laboratory where he had conducted his graduate research decades earlier. Frank declined Michael's invitation to explore the underground space, claiming he had other appointments. But Michael suspected the locksmith was simply uncomfortable with what they had uncovered. After Frank left, promising to send a bill and to forget where he had been that morning, Michael stood alone beside the open hatch, flashlight in hand, trying to summon the courage to descend. The stairs were steel grating, designed to prevent slipping, and they descended approximately 12 feet before ending at a landing. From there, Michael could see that a corridor extended in both directions, lit by a soft phosphorescent glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The engineering was remarkable, far beyond anything he would have expected from a private shelter built decades earlier. As he descended, Michael noted that the air quality was excellent, suggesting an active ventilation system. The walls were smooth concrete, reinforced with steel beams, and the floor was covered with a rubberized material that absorbed sound. Everything about the construction suggested a level of planning and resources that went far beyond what any private citizen would have needed or been able to afford. The corridor to the left ended after about 20 feet at a heavy door marked with radiation warning, symbols, and secured with multiple locks. Michael decided to explore the right-hand passage first, which led to what appeared to be a control room or monitoring station. Banks of equipment lined the walls, most of it powered down but clearly functional. Computer monitors, recording devices, and instruments he didn't recognize filled every available surface, but it was the wall of photographs that stopped him cold. Dozens of black and white images, clearly surveillance photos, showing people he didn't recognize in locations he couldn't identify. The photos appeared to span several decades, judging by the clothing and vehicles visible in the backgrounds, but they were arranged with an organizational logic that suggested ongoing monitoring rather than historical documentation. The surveillance photographs covered an entire wall, creating a mosaic of unknown lives captured in mundane moments. Some showed people entering buildings, others caught subjects in conversation on street corners, and a few appeared to be taken from considerable distances using telephoto lenses. What disturbed Michael most was the professional quality of the surveillance and the obvious resources required to maintain such extensive monitoring operations. In the center of the surveillance wall, in a place of obvious importance, was a file folder secured behind a sheet of plexiglass. The tab on the folder read simply, "Harrison, Michael A." Michael's hands were shaking as he found the release mechanism for the plexiglass cover. The folder contained what appeared to be a complete dossier of his life, but with details that no one should have known. His college transcripts, including grades from classes he barely remembered, medical records from a physical exam he had undergone for his first job with the Geological Survey, bank statements from accounts he had closed decades earlier, even personal correspondence, including letters he had written to his ex-wife during their divorce proceedings. But the most disturbing discovery was at the bottom of the file, a birth certificate with his name and correct birth date, but issued by a county clerk's office in a town he had never heard of. Dated 3 days before he was actually born, beneath the birth certificate was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. Subject has reached predetermined developmental markers. Recommend activation of Phase 3 protocol upon discovery of this facility. Authorization Project Looking Glass, classification level, cosmic date 15th October 1987. The date was significant. October 15th, 1987 was the day Michael had defended his doctoral dissertation, the day he had officially become Dr. Michael Harrison. According to the timestamp on the document, this authorization had been issued approximately 6 hours before his defense had even begun. Michael sank into the chair in front of the monitoring station, trying to process what he was seeing. The equipment around him hummed quietly, and several monitors flickered to life as if responding to his presence. One screen displayed what appeared to be a real-time map of the local area, with his property marked in red and several other locations highlighted in different colors. Another monitor showed a scrolling list of data that included his current heart rate, blood pressure, and other biometric information. They had been watching him. For how long, he couldn't say, but the evidence suggested surveillance that went back to his childhood, perhaps to his birth. The revelation was both terrifying and impossible to fully comprehend. Who had this level of resources? Who had this kind of reach? And most importantly, why him? As he sat in the chair, Michael became aware of a soft chiming sound coming from somewhere deeper in the facility. Following the sound, he discovered another corridor that led to what appeared to be a communications center. Multiple radio and satellite communication systems lined the walls, and in the center of the room, a red light was blinking on what appeared to be an automated transmission device. A mechanical voice began speaking. Phase 3 activation confirmed. Subject has achieved primary objective. Initiating contact protocol. Stand by for briefing. Michael backed away from the device, but it was too late. Somewhere in the facility, systems he didn't understand were coming online, responding to his presence in ways that had clearly been programmed long before his arrival. He had stumbled into something far more complex and dangerous than a simple underground shelter. As he turned to leave, to escape back to the surface and the familiar world above. Michael found his path blocked by a figure standing at the bottom of the stairs. It was a woman, perhaps 50 years old, dressed in clothing that seemed decades out of date. She looked exactly like someone from one of the surveillance photographs on the wall. "Hello, Michael," she said, her voice carrying a strange accent he couldn't identify. "We've been waiting a very long time for you to find us." The woman who blocked Michael's path moved with the careful precision of someone accustomed to confined spaces and potentially dangerous situations. Her clothing, while dated, was clean and well-maintained. A simple grey dress that might have been fashionable in the 1960s, sensible shoes, and a small pendant around her neck that caught the phosphorescent light from the walls. "My name is Dr. Sarah Chen," she said, extending her hand in a gesture that seemed both formal and genuinely welcoming. "I realize this must be overwhelming, but I need you to remain calm while I explain what's happening here." Michael found himself shaking her hand automatically, his mind struggling to process the impossibility of her presence. "How did you get in here? How long have you been down here? And what do you mean you've been waiting for me?" Dr. Chen gestured toward the communications center where the automated systems continued their quiet chiming. "I've been monitoring your approach for the past 18 months. Ever since our seismic analysis indicated that the earthquake fault line would eventually reach your property. We knew the ground rupture would expose the facility, and we knew you would be curious enough to investigate." She led him back toward the control room, moving with the familiarity of someone who had spent considerable time in these corridors. "As for how long I've been here, that's a more complicated question than you might think. Time operates differently when you're part of Project Looking Glass." Michael stopped walking. "Project Looking Glass, that was on the authorization document in my file." "What is it?" "It's the reason you were born, Michael. The reason your grandfather was guided to purchase this specific piece of land. The reason your career in geology led you to specialize in seismic activity. The reason your marriage ended when it did. And the reason you chose to retire to this exact location." Dr. Chen's voice was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather rather than revealing that his entire life had been orchestrated by unknown forces. "That's impossible," Michael said. But even as he spoke the words, he was remembering the strange coincidences that had shaped his major life decisions. The professor who had suggested he focus on earthquake prediction, the job offer that had brought him to the Pacific Northwest, the real estate agent who had specifically recommended this property when he was looking for a place to retire. Dr. Chen activated one of the monitors in the control room, and a series of documents appeared on the screen. Project Looking Glass was initiated in 1952, shortly after certain discoveries were made regarding the nature of time and causality. The project's mission was to identify and monitor individuals whose lives would intersect with significant temporal anomalies. The documents on the screen showed organizational charts, budget allocations, and personnel assignments spanning several decades. Michael recognized some of the government agency logos, though many of the classification markings were unlike anything he had seen before. "You're telling me this is some kind of government project?" Michael asked. "Was," Dr. Chen corrected. "Official funding ended in 1987, the same year you completed your doctorate. But the project continued under private sponsorship with a much more focused mission." She touched another control, and the screen displayed what appeared to be a complex timeline diagram. Michael's life was represented as a red line threading through various historical events, with notation marks indicating what the document labeled as intervention points. "Every person's life creates ripples in the fabric of space-time," Dr. Chen explained. "Most people create small ripples that fade quickly, but certain individuals, through the combination of their actions and the timing of those actions, create disturbances that propagate both forward and backward through time. You are one of those individuals." Michael studied the timeline, noting how his geological surveys and research had intersected with several major earthquake events. My work predicting seismic activity is only part of it, Dr. Chen said. Your specific research into fault line progression in the Pacific Northwest provided crucial data that prevented a catastrophic earthquake in 2019. Without your intervention, the Cascadia subduction zone would have experienced a magnitude 9.2 event that would have killed over 200,000 people. But I never published research about the Cascadia zone. I focused on smaller regional fault systems. Dr. Chen smiled sadly. You published it in 2023, 3 years from now. The information you're going to discover in this facility will lead you to identify a previously unknown stress accumulation pattern along the subduction zone. Your warning will prompt emergency preparedness measures that will save those lives. The implications of what she was saying hit Michael like a physical blow. You're claiming to know the future. I'm claiming to have lived it, Dr. Chen said. I was born in 2031, Michael. I volunteered for the temporal displacement program that brought me back to this time to ensure that certain crucial events occur as they should. Michael sank into the nearest chair, his mind reeling. Everything he thought he understood about physics, about causality, about the basic nature of reality, was being systematically dismantled. This is insane. Time travel is science fiction, Michael said, gripping the arms of his chair. So was spaceflight until it wasn't. So was instant global communication until it wasn't. The mathematics of temporal displacement were actually worked out in the 1970s, but the technology required to implement them wasn't developed until the 2020s. Dr. Chen activated another monitor, which displayed complex mathematical equations that were far beyond Michael's understanding. The facility you've discovered isn't just a monitoring station, she continued. It's a temporal anchor point, designed to maintain stability in this specific location across multiple timeline configurations. Your presence here activates certain protocols that have been dormant for decades. As if responding to her words, the lighting in the facility shifted from the soft phosphorescent glow to a warmer, more natural illumination. Additional systems came online, and Michael could hear the hum of machinery starting up elsewhere in the complex. What kind of protocols? Michael asked. Dr. Chen hesitated, and for the first time since their encounter began, she looked genuinely troubled. That's where things become complicated. The temporal displacement technology that brought me here is crude compared to what will be developed in the coming decades. My presence in this time period is creating increasing instability in the local space-time fabric. She led him to another section of the facility that Michael hadn't yet explored. A laboratory area filled with equipment that looked like nothing he had ever seen. Crystalline structures hummed with energy, and displays showed readings that seemed to fluctuate in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The walls themselves seemed to bend and shift slightly, creating an optical illusion that made Michael feel dizzy. The original plan was for me to provide guidance and then return to my own time once your research was complete. But something has gone wrong. The temporal anchor that was supposed to facilitate my return has been damaged by the same earthquake that exposed this facility. Michael examined the crystalline structures, noting how they seemed to pulse with an internal light that didn't behave like any normal illumination. The equipment around them defied easy categorization. Some devices looked vaguely medical, others resembled computer terminals, but most were completely alien to his experience. "What happens if you can't return?" he asked. "The longer I remain in this time period, the more the timeline begins to fracture. Changes that should be minor become major. Events that were supposed to happen don't occur. People who should have been born never exist." Dr. Chen's voice was heavy with the weight of responsibility. Eventually, the cumulative effect could unravel the entire sequence of events that leads to the development of the technology that made my mission possible in the first place. "A temporal paradox," Michael said, "beginning to understand the scope of the problem." "Exactly. And you're the only person in this time period with the combination of scientific knowledge and security clearance necessary to help repair the temporal anchor. Michael looked around the laboratory, noting the sophisticated equipment and the obvious signs that this facility had been designed for exactly this kind of problem. Security clearance? I'm a retired geologist. I don't have any kind of government clearance. Dr. Chen handed him a folder that had been sitting on one of the laboratory benches. Inside were documents that bore his name and signature, along with security classifications he had never seen before. The dates on the documents were current, but he had no memory of signing them. You received cosmic level clearance in 1987, the same day you defended your dissertation. The clearance was activated automatically when you first entered this facility. According to the documentation I have, you've been read into Project Looking Glass for over 30 years, though your conscious memories of that briefing were suppressed until now. As Michael read through the documents, fragmentary memories began surfacing. A meeting in a windowless conference room shortly after his graduation. Men in dark suits who had asked detailed questions about his research and his plans for the future. An oath of secrecy that he had thought was related to potential consulting work with the government. The memory suppression was temporary, Dr. Chen explained, designed to activate when you gained access to this facility. It was the only way to ensure that your life would develop naturally while still maintaining your clearance for when it became necessary. Michael set the folder aside and looked directly at Dr. Chen. Assuming I believe any of this, assuming you're really from the future and I'm somehow crucial to preventing a temporal paradox, what exactly do you need me to do? Dr. Chen smiled, and for the first time, Michael saw genuine warmth in her expression. I need you to help me fix time itself, Michael. And we need to do it before the timeline fractures become irreversible. She led him to a workstation that displayed what appeared to be the technical specifications for the temporal anchor system. The diagrams were incredibly complex, showing crystalline matrices and energy, flow patterns that reminded Michael of the geological surveys he had conducted of underground water systems. The anchor system requires a specific type of crystalline structure that occurs naturally in very few locations worldwide. This facility was built here because the bedrock contains one of the largest known deposits of what we call temporal resonance crystals. Michael examined the geological survey data that Dr. Chen called up on the screen. The mineral composition was unlike anything he had encountered in his professional career, but there were similarities to quartz formations he had studied in other locations. The crystal structures showed a regular pattern that seemed almost too perfect to be natural. The earthquake that exposed this facility also damaged the primary resonance chamber. Dr. Chen continued, we need to repair the crystalline matrix using naturally occurring deposits from the surrounding area. But extracting and processing the crystals requires expertise in both geology and temporal engineering. And you need my geological knowledge to identify and extract the right type of crystals, Michael said, beginning to understand his role in the solution. More than that, the extraction process has to be done in a way that doesn't destabilize the remaining deposits. One mistake could trigger a cascade collapse of the entire local crystal formation, which would make repair impossible and guarantee that the temporal fractures become permanent. Dr. Chen activated a three-dimensional model of the underground crystal formations that extended beneath Michael's property and the surrounding area. The deposits were far more extensive than he would have guessed, following fault lines and forming natural resonance chambers that seemed almost too perfect to be the result of random geological processes. These formations, Michael said, studying the patterns, they're not natural, are they? The base mineral deposits are natural, but they've been shaped and enhanced over the past 70 years by carefully controlled seismic events. Every minor earthquake in this region, every shift in the fault lines, has been part of a long-term engineering project designed to create the optimal crystalline structure for temporal anchor operations. The implications were staggering. Michael realized that his entire career studying regional seismic activity had been part of a larger project that he hadn't even known existed. His research into fault line progression, his analysis of minor earthquake patterns, even his decision to move to this specific location had all been guided by people working to maintain this temporal anchor system. "How many people know about this?" he asked. "Fewer than you might think. Project Looking Glass has operated with a very small core team. Most of the people involved in the day-to-day operations don't know the full scope of what they're supporting. They think they're working on earthquake prediction or geological survey projects." Dr. Chen pulled up another display, showing the network of temporal anchor sites around the world. Michael counted at least 12 locations, scattered across different continents and marked with varying levels of operational status. This is one of 7 primary anchor points that maintain temporal stability for the entire North American continent. If this site fails, the ripple effects will destabilize the other anchor points in a cascade failure that could affect the entire global timeline. Michael studied the global network, noting how the anchor points seem to be positioned at locations of known geological instability. You're using natural fault lines and seismic activity to power these temporal anchors. The Earth's natural energy systems provide the power we need to maintain temporal stability. But it's a delicate balance. Too much seismic activity and the crystal formations shatter. Too little, and there isn't enough energy to maintain the temporal fields. And right now, the balance is failing, Michael said, understanding the urgency of their situation. Right now, we have perhaps 72 hours before the damage becomes irreversible. After that, not even repairing this anchor point will be enough to prevent a global temporal cascade. Over the next several hours, Dr. Chen guided Michael through the deeper archives of the facility, revealing rooms filled with documentation that told the complete story of Project Looking Glass. The archives were vast, containing decades of reports, personnel files, and technical specifications that painted a picture of an operation far more extensive than Michael had imagined. The project began in 1952, when a team of physicists at Los Alamos discovered that certain nuclear tests were creating measurable distortions in the local flow of time. Dr. Chen explained as they walked through rows of filing cabinets and document storage systems. Initially, they thought it was an error in their measuring equipment, but repeated experiments confirmed that high-energy events could actually bend the fabric of space-time. The early documents showed the gradual evolution of the project from basic research into practical application. Scientists had identified naturally occurring locations where the Earth's geological structure created conditions similar to those produced by nuclear tests, but on a much smaller and more stable scale. They discovered that certain mineral formations, particularly crystalline structures formed under specific geological pressure, could serve as natural focal points for temporal energy. The Pacific Northwest became a primary research area because of the unique combination of seismic activity and mineral deposits. Michael studied the geological surveys from the 1950s and 1960s, noting how they focused on the same fault lines and crystal formations that Dr. Chen had shown him earlier. They were mapping the entire regional crystal network even back then. "Your grandfather wasn't randomly selected to purchase this property," Dr. Chen said, pulling out a thick file labeled Harrison William Recruitment. "Yeah, he was approached by project representatives who convinced him that the land was a good investment. They provided the down payment and favorable financing terms to ensure he could afford it." The file contained correspondence between projectee officials and Michael's grandfather, though the letters were written in a way that made the transaction appear completely normal. References to geological survey rights and mineral exploration permissions were scattered throughout the documents, but they were phrased as standard real estate considerations rather than the beginning of a multi-generational surveillance operation. They knew that eventually, someone with the right combination of geological expertise and personal connection to this location would be needed to maintain the temporal anchor system. Dr. Chen continued, "Your grandfather was selected not just for his willingness to cooperate, but because genetic analysis suggested that his descendants would likely develop the intellectual capabilities necessary for the work." Michael found himself staring at genetic charts and family lineage analyses that went back several generations. The level of planning and foresight was almost incomprehensible. "You're saying they bred my family like experimental animals. They guided certain choices and created opportunities that made specific outcomes more likely. Your grandfather met your grandmother at a social event organized by project personnel. Your father's education was subsidized through a scholarship program that steered him toward engineering studies. Your parents' marriage was encouraged through job opportunities that brought them together. The documentation was meticulous and disturbing. Michael could trace the subtle influences that had shaped his family's decisions for decades. Job transfers that had moved his parents to specific locations, educational opportunities that had appeared at crucial moments, even social introductions that had led to marriages and relationships were documented as project interventions. What about my ex-wife? Was Janet part of this too? Dr. Chen's expression became sympathetic. Janet was never part of the project, which is why your marriage was allowed to fail. The project needed you to remain in this location without the complications of family responsibilities that might interfere with your eventual mission. Michael felt a surge of anger at the manipulation, but also a strange sense of relief. His marriage had ended because of fundamental incompatibilities, not because of some elaborate conspiracy. At least, that part of his life had been genuine. The network extends far beyond your family, Dr. Chen said, showing him organizational charts that revealed the scope of the operation. We've identified over 300 individuals worldwide, whose lives have been influenced by the project over the past 70 years. Scientists, engineers, government officials, even artists and writers whose work would eventually influence public perception of temporal phenomena. The archives contained files on people whose names Michael recognized from scientific journals and government positions. All of them had been guided, influenced, or recruited to support various aspects of the temporal anchor network, most without ever knowing the true nature of their contribution. Dr. Chen led Michael to what she called the Temporal Monitoring Center, a chamber filled with displays that tracked timeline stability across the globe in real time. The screen showed patterns of data that looked like weather maps, but instead of tracking atmospheric conditions, they were monitoring the flow of time itself. "This is what I was afraid you'd find," Dr. Chen said, indicating a cluster of red warning indicators spreading across the main display. "The temporal fractures aren't just local anymore. My extended presence here is beginning to affect the timeline on a global scale." Michael studied the displays, trying to apply his geological training to understanding patterns in something as abstract as the flow of time. The disturbances seemed to follow predictable patterns, radiating outward from specific points and interacting with what Dr. Chen identified as natural temporal stress lines. "It's like watching fault line propagation," he said, "but instead of tectonic stress, you're dealing with temporal stress." "Exactly, and just as seismic stress can build up until it releases in a major earthquake, temporal stress can accumulate until it releases in what we call a cascade event. If that happens, entire segments of history could be rewritten or simply cease to exist." The cascade prediction model filled one entire wall of the monitoring center. Complex algorithms processed millions of variables to forecast how timeline distortions would propagate through space and time. The current projections showed branching, possibilities that grew increasingly chaotic as they extended into the future. Dr. Chen activated another section of the display, showing a timeline that Michael recognized as his own life. But instead of the single red line he had seen earlier, there were now multiple lines branching and converging in patterns that became increasingly chaotic as they approached the present moment. These are the alternate timelines that are beginning to manifest as a result of the temporal instability, she explained. In one of these timelines, you became a mining engineer instead of a research geologist. In another, you died in a car accident when you were 23. In a third, you never went to college at all and spent your life as a forest ranger. Michael traced the divergent lines with his finger, noting how the variations seemed to amplify over time. As he studied the display, he began to experience brief flashes of memories that didn't belong to his life. Images of himself in different clothes, in different locations, making different choices. The sensation was disorienting and frightening. "What happens to the people in those other timelines?" he asked, steadying himself against the control console. "That's the heart of the ethical dilemma we're facing. From a strictly technical standpoint, those alternate versions of your life are just as valid as the one you remember living. The people who exist in those timelines, the relationships you formed, the work you accomplished, all of it is real to them." Dr. Chen's voice carried a weight of personal experience that made Michael suspect she was speaking from more than just theoretical knowledge. When we collapse the timeline back to a single, stable configuration, all of those alternate realities cease to exist. Billions of people who think they're living normal lives simply vanish, along with all the choices they've made and the love they've shared. The monitoring systems began issuing soft warning chimes as new fracture points appeared on the global display. Michael could see timeline distortions spreading across the Pacific Northwest, creating ripple effects that were beginning to affect major population centers. Seattle showed signs of temporal instability. Portland registered increasing anomalies. Even distant cities like San Francisco and Vancouver were beginning to show minor distortions. "How long do we have?" Michael asked, watching the cascade predictions update in real time. The models suggest that once the distortions reach critical mass in major population centers, we'll have less than 6 hours before the cascade becomes irreversible. At the current rate of expansion, that gives us approximately 58 hours from now. Michael noticed that his hands were trembling slightly, and when he looked in a reflective surface, his appearance seemed to flicker briefly between different versions of himself. The temporal instability was beginning to affect him directly, causing him to partially exist in multiple timelines simultaneously. The closer you are to the source of the distortion, the more you'll experience these effects, Dr. Chen explained, noticing his distress. It's one of the reasons why temporal displacement missions are limited in duration. Extended exposure to timeline fractures can cause permanent psychological damage or complete identity dissociation. She showed him medical monitoring equipment that was tracking his vital signs and brain activity. The readings showed patterns that were distinctly abnormal, with neural activity spiking in regions associated with memory formation and identity processing. Dr. Chen led Michael to a specialized equipment room that contained tools unlike anything he had seen in his geological career. The extraction equipment was designed specifically for working in unstable temporal fields, with instruments that could maintain their functionality even when the flow of time around them became distorted. Standard geological equipment won't work once we begin the extraction process, Dr. Chen explained, showing him devices that seemed to combine familiar drilling and sampling tools with crystalline components that hummed with energy. These instruments are calibrated to remain temporally synchronized, regardless of local time distortions. Michael examined the equipment carefully, noting how each tool was marked with symbols that indicated its specific function and temporal stability rating. The drilling apparatus looked similar to core sampling equipment he had used throughout his career, but the addition of crystalline resonance chambers and temporal field generators made it far more complex. The extraction process requires incredible precision, Dr. Chen continued, activating a three-dimensional model that showed the underground crystal formations in detail. We need to remove damaged crystals and install replacement structures without disrupting the overall harmonic frequency of the formation. The model revealed the intricate nature of the crystal network beneath his property. Individual crystals were connected through natural fracture lines that created a resonance pattern spanning several acres. Disrupting any part of the network incorrectly could cause the entire formation to collapse, making temporal anchor repair impossible. It's like performing surgery on a musical instrument while someone is playing it, Michael said, beginning to understand the complexity of their task. An excellent analogy. The temporal anchor depends on the crystals maintaining a specific harmonic resonance. If we extract crystals in the wrong sequence or damage the connecting fracture lines, the entire formation will lose coherence. Dr. Chen showed him the extraction sequence that had been calculated based on harmonic analysis of the crystal network. The process would require removing crystals from 12 specific locations in a precise order, with timing intervals that had to be maintained within seconds to prevent resonance cascade failure. The temporal fields around each crystal site will be highly unstable during extraction, she warned. You may experience temporal displacement effects, memory fluctuations, and possibly brief episodes where you exist in multiple timelines simultaneously. Michael studied the medical monitoring equipment that would track his condition throughout the extraction process. The devices were designed to maintain biological stability, even when the operator was experiencing temporal displacement effects. What kind of displacement effects? He asked. Brief jumps forward or backward in time, usually just a few seconds or minutes. Temporary access to memories from alternate timelines. In extreme cases, you might briefly encounter alternate versions of yourself who are performing the same extraction in different timeline configurations. Dr. Chen activated a training simulation that allowed Michael to practice using the extraction equipment in a controlled environment. The simulation recreated the conditions he would face underground, including the disorienting effects of temporal field distortions. As Michael worked through the training exercises, he began to experience the memory fluctuations that Dr. Chen had warned him about. Brief flashes of knowledge and experience from alternate versions of himself began filtering into his consciousness. In one timeline, he had become a mining engineer with extensive experience in underground crystal extraction. In another, he had spent years studying temporal physics and understood the theoretical principles behind their equipment. The knowledge bleed from alternate timelines can actually be helpful. Dr. Chen observed as Michael demonstrated unexpected familiarity with the temporal field generators. Your alternate selves have different skill sets that complement your geological expertise. The preparation process took most of the remaining daylight hours. Michael had to learn not just how to operate the extraction equipment, but how to maintain his identity and purpose when experiencing temporal displacement effects. The psychological preparation was as important as the technical training. Remember that no matter what you see or experience during the extraction, your primary timeline identity is anchored to this facility, Dr. Chen instructed. The pendant I'm giving you will help maintain your temporal coherence. She handed him a small crystalline device similar to the one she wore around her neck. The moment Michael put it on, the flickering sensation he had been experiencing stabilized, and his sense of identity became more solid. The extraction begins at dawn, Dr. Chen said, as they completed the final equipment checks. We'll have one opportunity to get this right. If we fail, or if the extraction triggers a cascade collapse, there won't be time for a second attempt. Michael looked at the equipment that would determine the fate of global timeline stability, knowing that tomorrow would test every skill he had developed over his entire career in ways he never could have imagined. Dawn came with an unsettling quality to the light, as if the sun itself was struggling to maintain consistency across the fractured timelines. Michael and Dr. Chen emerged from the facility to find that the earthquake fissure had widened during the night, and strange distortions in the air marked the locations where they would need to extract the replacement crystals. The temporal instability is accelerating, Dr. Chen observed, checking her monitoring equipment. We're seeing localized time dilation effects that weren't predicted by our models. Michael could see what she meant. Near the largest crystal formation, the morning mist seemed to hang frozen in impossible patterns, creating spiral formations that defied natural air movement. The trees at the edge of the extraction zone showed leaves in different seasonal states on the same branches, as if time was flowing at different rates in different locations. The primary resonance crystal formation was located approximately 30 feet below ground, accessed through a shaft that Dr. Chen's equipment had carved during the night. The shaft descended through layers of sedimentary rock before reaching the chamber that contained the massive crystalline structure at the heart of the temporal anchor system. "This is it," Dr. Chen said as they descended into the extraction chamber. "The primary resonance crystal. It's been the focal point of temporal stability for this entire region for over 70 years. The crystal was unlike anything Michael had encountered in his geological career. Nearly 8 feet tall and perfectly formed, it seemed to contain an internal light that pulsed in rhythm, with patterns he couldn't identify. The surrounding chamber was natural, formed by geological processes. But the crystal itself showed signs of artificial enhancement and maintenance. "The damage is more extensive than we hoped," Dr. Chen said, examining the crystal with specialized instruments. "The earthquake created fracture lines that are disrupting the harmonic resonance. We'll need to extract damaged sections and integrate replacement crystals in a way that maintains the overall structure." Michael began the delicate process of identifying which crystal segments could be safely removed without destabilizing the entire formation. The temporal extraction equipment responded to his movements with subtle adjustments, maintaining synchronization with the fluctuating time fields around them. As he worked, Michael began experiencing the temporal displacement effects that Dr. Chen had warned him about. Brief glimpses of alternate timelines showed him different versions of this same extraction, some successful, others ending in catastrophic failure. In one particularly vivid flash, he saw himself as an older man, working alongside Dr. Chen in a timeline where they had been colleagues for decades. "Stay focused on this timeline," Dr. Chen reminded him, noting his momentary disorientation. "The alternate memories can be overwhelming, but your primary mission is here and now." The extraction process required extreme precision. Each crystal segment had to be removed using techniques that preserved the harmonic connections to adjacent crystals. Michael found himself drawing on knowledge from his alternate selves, combining his geological expertise with mining techniques and temporal physics that he had never studied in his own timeline. The most dangerous moment came when they reached the core crystal segment, a formation that served as the primary resonance generator for the entire anchor system. The temporal fields around the core were so unstable that reality itself seemed to flicker between different configurations. "If this extraction fails, the cascade will begin immediately," Dr. Chen warned. "We won't have time to evacuate or prepare emergency protocols." Michael carefully positioned the extraction equipment around the core crystal, using instruments that had to be constantly recalibrated as the temporal fields shifted. The crystalline pendant around his neck grew warm, working to maintain his temporal coherence as the displacement effects intensified. As he began the core extraction, Michael briefly found himself working alongside alternate versions of himself from different timelines. For a few moments, 3 different versions of Michael Harrison were extracting the same crystal simultaneously, their actions synchronized across multiple realities. "Now," Dr. Chen called out as the harmonic resonance reached the optimal frequency for extraction. Michael activated the extraction sequence, and the core crystal separated from its geological matrix with a sound like the earth itself sighing. The moment it was free, the temporal fields in the chamber stabilized, and the alternate versions of himself faded back to their own timelines. "Perfect extraction," Dr. Chen confirmed, examining the undamaged crystal. "Now we need to install the replacement matrix before the resonance field collapses completely." The replacement crystals had been grown in the facility's laboratory using techniques that Michael was beginning to understand through his exposure to alternate timeline memories. The installation process would be even more dangerous than the extraction, requiring them to establish new harmonic connections while the entire temporal anchor system balanced on the edge of failure. As Michael and Dr. Chen began the installation of the replacement crystal matrix, the facility's emergency beacon activated without warning. A piercing tone echoed through the underground chambers, accompanied by flashing lights that indicated an immediate threat to the temporal anchor system. "That's impossible," Dr. Chen said, checking her monitoring equipment. "The beacon only activates when other temporal agents are detected in the area." Michael looked up from the delicate crystal installation work, noting how the temporal fields around them had suddenly become more chaotic. "Other temporal agents? You mean there are more people from the future here?" Before Dr. Chen could answer, 3 figures materialized in the extraction chamber through what appeared to be localized temporal distortions. They wore clothing from different historical periods, and each carried equipment that was clearly more advanced than anything Dr. Chen had shown him. "Dr. Chen," said the lead figure, a woman who appeared to be in her 40s and dressed in what looked like clothing from the 1980s. "You were ordered to abort this mission 18 hours ago. The Temporal Council has determined that the timeline collapse is preferable to the cascade effects that your repair will cause." Dr. Chen stepped protectively between Michael and the new arrivals. "Agent Morrison, the Council doesn't understand the full scope of what will happen if this anchor fails. We're not just talking about regional timeline instability." The second figure, a man dressed in modern military fatigues, activated a device that scanned the crystal installation work. "The repair sequence you're implementing will create resonance harmonics that interfere with anchor sites in 7 other temporal zones. The cure is worse than the disease." Michael found himself caught in the middle of what was clearly a conflict between different factions of time travelers. The third figure, dressed in clothing that seemed to be from several decades in the future, remained silent but kept watching Michael with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Agent Chen," the military figure continued, "you've exceeded your authorized temporal displacement duration by 43 hours. Your continued presence here is destabilizing not just this timeline, but the temporal corridors that connect all active zones." Dr. Chen's expression hardened. "The mathematical models that the Council is using are incomplete. They don't account for the cascade multiplication effects that begin once major population centers are affected. If we don't complete this repair, the timeline collapse will propagate to every anchor site on the continent within 72 hours. The emergency beacon that had brought the other agents to their location was a sophisticated device built into the facility's communication systems. Michael could see that it was designed to automatically signal whenever temporal extraction work reached a critical phase, alerting other agents who might have competing interests in the outcome. "Dr. Harrison," Agent Morrison addressed Michael directly, "you need to understand that what Dr. Chen is asking you to do will save this timeline at the cost of destroying 6 others. Billions of people in alternate timelines will cease to exist because of your actions." Michael looked between the competing agents, trying to process the moral complexity of their situation. "How do I know which of you is telling the truth?" The future-dressed agent finally spoke, her voice carrying an accent that suggested English had evolved significantly in her time period. Truth is relative when dealing with temporal mechanics. Each timeline that survives creates its own version of truth. The question is not which truth is correct, but which truth leads to the best outcome for the greatest number of people. Dr. Chen activated her own scanning equipment, revealing that the other agents were carrying devices designed to disrupt the crystal installation work. They're not here to debate ethics. They're here to stop us from completing the repair, because completion of this repair will trigger a temporal war, Agent Morrison said. The anchor sites that your repair will destabilize are defended by other temporal factions. Your actions here will lead to direct conflict between time-traveling forces, with battles fought across multiple centuries. Michael realized that the crystal installation work had to continue despite the presence of the other agents. The temporal fields were too unstable to leave the anchor system partially repaired, and delay would guarantee cascade failure, regardless of the political consequences. "I need to finish the installation," he said, turning back to the crystal matrix. "Whatever the consequences, leaving this half-done will definitely result in timeline collapse." The other agents moved to stop him, but Dr. Chen activated defensive systems that created temporal barriers around the installation site. The chamber filled with conflicting energy fields as different temporal technologies clashed, creating distortions that made it difficult to determine what was real and what was displacement effect. As the temporal barriers fluctuated around the crystal installation site, Michael noticed something that made his blood run cold. Dr. Chen's defensive equipment was synchronized with the devices carried by the other agents. The energy signatures were identical, suggesting they all came from the same source technology. "You're working together," Michael said, stepping back from the crystal matrix. "This whole conflict is staged." Dr. Chen's expression didn't change, but Agent Morrison smiled grimly. "Very perceptive, Dr. Harrison. Yes, we're all part of the same temporal operation, though we represent different phases of the mission. The master control interface that Agent Morrison activated was far more sophisticated than anything Dr. Chen had shown him. The device projected a holographic display that revealed the true scope of the temporal anchor network, showing not just the 7 sites Dr. Chen had mentioned, but dozens of anchor points spanning multiple centuries. Project Looking Glass evolved far beyond what the original 1952 research envisioned, the military agent explained. "We discovered that temporal stability requires active management across multiple timeline configurations simultaneously." Michael studied the holographic display, noting how timeline branches were being constantly pruned and guided by interventions from different temporal agents. "You're not just monitoring timelines. You're creating them. We're gardening them," Dr. Chen said, her voice carrying a weight of authority that hadn't been present before. "Growing the timelines that lead to optimal outcomes and pruning those that lead to catastrophic futures." The future-dressed agent stepped forward, revealing that her equipment included detailed records of Michael's life across hundreds of different timeline configurations. "You exist in 847 different timeline variants, Dr. Harrison. In 203 of those timelines, you complete the crystal repair and prevent the cascade failure. In 644 timelines, you refuse to complete the repair, leading to various forms of temporal collapse." Michael felt the weight of parallel existence pressing down on him. "What happens in the timelines where I complete the repair?" 47 of those timelines lead to temporal war between competing time travel factions, Agent Morrison said. 96 lead to technological singularities that fundamentally alter human consciousness. 60 lead to timeline configurations that prevent the development of time travel technology entirely, creating temporal paradoxes that unravel causality. "And the rest?" Michael asked, Dr. Chen activated another section of the master control interface, showing timeline projections that extended thousands of years into the future. The rest lead to stable temporal configurations that allow human civilization to develop time travel technology responsibly, with built-in safeguards that prevent the kind of temporal warfare that we're trying to avoid. Michael realized that his entire life and the lives of countless others were being evaluated based on their utility in creating optimal future timelines. So the earthquake that exposed this facility, my decision to investigate even this conversation, it's all been orchestrated to test which version of me will make the right choice. Not just you, the future agent said. We're running similar tests with key individuals across multiple temporal anchor sites. The decisions made by people like you in the next 72 hours will determine which of the possible futures becomes the dominant timeline. The master control interface revealed that similar facilities existed at every temporal anchor site, each one designed to test crucial decision-makers when timeline stability reached critical points. The network was vast, spanning centuries and involving thousands of individuals who believed they were making autonomous choices. The temporal war you mentioned, Michael said, is it happening now, across multiple timelines? It's been happening for subjective centuries, Dr. Chen replied. Different factions of time travelers, each convinced that their version of optimal timeline management is correct. We've been fighting battles across past and future, trying to create stable configurations that all factions can accept. Agent Morrison showed him records of temporal conflicts that had raged across different historical periods. The American Civil War was influenced by temporal agents trying to create different baseline timelines. World War II involved at least 6 different time-traveling factions. The Cold War was partially a proxy conflict between competing temporal management philosophies. Michael studied the battle records, noting how historical events that he had thought were random or inevitable had actually been shaped by time travelers from multiple futures fighting to control the development of human civilization. "Why me?" he asked. "Why is my decision so crucial?" "Because you're one of the few people in this time period who has the combination of technical knowledge, moral reasoning and temporal displacement resistance necessary to make an informed choice," Dr. Chen explained. "Most people would be driven insane by the knowledge of what's at stake. You have the psychological stability to choose wisely." The revelation of the temporal war left Michael feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of the choice before him. The agent stepped back, allowing him space to process the implications. While the crystal installation equipment waited in suspended animation around the partially completed repair, "You need to understand the full scope of what we're asking," Dr. Chen said, activating a device that she called the temporal lock. The mechanism was built into the facility's core systems, designed to permanently stabilize whatever timeline configuration was chosen. Once you complete the crystal repair and activate the lock, that decision becomes irreversible across all timeline variants. Michael examined the temporal lock, noting its similarity to the wheel lock mechanism that had sealed the facility's entrance. "You're saying that if I complete the repair, every other version of me across hundreds of timelines will be locked into making the same choice?" "Exactly," Agent Morrison confirmed. "The temporal lock creates what we call convergence cascade. All timeline variants collapse into a single stable configuration based on the choice made by the prime version of the decision-maker." The weight of responsibility was staggering. Michael wasn't just choosing the fate of his own timeline, but determining the outcome for hundreds of alternate versions of himself and the billions of people whose lives would be affected by his decision. "What happens to the other versions of me?" he asked. The future agent consulted her records. They ceased to exist as independent entities, but their experiences and memories become integrated into the prime timeline version. You would retain awareness of their lives, their relationships, their achievements and failures. Michael thought about the brief glimpses he had already experienced of his alternate selves. The mining engineer who had never gone to college. The forest ranger who had spent his life in quiet solitude. The version of himself who had remained married to Janet and raised children. All of those lives, all of those choices would be absorbed into his consciousness if he activated the temporal lock. "There's something else you need to know," Dr. Chen said quietly. "I'm not from 2031, as I told you initially. I'm from 2157, and I'm one of your descendants." The revelation hit Michael like a physical blow. "My descendant?" "In the timeline where you complete the repair and activate the temporal lock, you eventually marry Elena Kowalski's granddaughter. Your genetic line continues through 6 generations before producing the temporal displacement technology that allowed me to come back to this time period," Agent Morrison added. "In the timelines where you refuse to complete the repair, your genetic line ends with you. The cascade failures prevent the development of the civilization that would produce your descendants." Michael realized that his choice would determine not just the fate of human civilization, but the existence of his own future family. "So if I don't complete the repair, you never exist. Neither do the billions of people who will be born over the next 2 centuries in the stable timeline configuration," Dr. Chen replied. "But the alternate timeline versions of yourself who died in car accidents or lived different lives will continue to exist until the cascade failures reach them." The moral calculus was impossibly complex. Save the current timeline and collapse hundreds of others, or allow the cascade failure to proceed and preserve the alternate timelines at the cost of future civilization. Michael found himself thinking about the conversations he had overheard between different versions of himself. During the crystal extraction, in the brief moments when multiple timelines had overlapped, he had sensed the determination and purpose of his alternate selves. They were all facing the same choice, wrestling with the same moral dilemma. "Can I communicate with the other versions of myself?" he asked. Dr. Chen activated monitoring equipment that could detect cross-timeline communication signatures. The temporal instability around the anchor site makes limited communication possible, but only for a few more minutes before the window closes. Michael approached the communications array, feeling the presence of his alternate selves across the fractured timelines. For a brief moment, he could sense their thoughts, their fears, their understanding of what was at stake. The forest ranger version of himself had spent decades thinking about the balance between preservation and change. The mining engineer understood the risks of working with unstable systems. The married version of himself knew the weight of responsibility for protecting future generations. Across all the timelines, every version of Michael Harrison had reached the same conclusion. The risk of temporal war, the cost of destroying alternate realities, the moral complexity of choosing which lives deserved to continue. All of it pointed toward the same difficult but necessary decision. Michael turned back to the crystal installation equipment with newfound resolve. The weight of responsibility hadn't diminished, but his understanding of what needed to be done had crystallized through his communication with the alternate versions of himself. "I'm going to complete the repair," he announced to the temporal agents. "But I want to understand exactly how the convergence process will work." Dr. Chen activated the convergence chamber controls, revealing a section of the facility that extended beyond the normal spatial dimensions. The chamber was a perfect sphere lined with crystalline structures that hummed with temporal energy, designed to serve as the focal point where all timeline possibilities would intersect and resolve into a single stable configuration. The convergence process begins the moment you install the final crystal component, she explained. All timeline variants will start collapsing toward the prime configuration, beginning with the timelines most similar to this one and gradually incorporating the more divergent alternatives. Michael entered the convergence chamber, noting how the space seemed to exist outside normal physics. He could see reflections of himself working in parallel chambers, each one representing a different timeline, approaching the same convergence point. As he began the final phase of the crystal installation, Michael started experiencing the memories and knowledge of his alternate selves more intensely. The mining engineer's expertise in underground structural integrity, the forest ranger's deep understanding of natural systems and balance, the married version's knowledge of compromise and responsibility. The integration is beginning, Agent Morrison observed, monitoring the temporal fields around the chamber. Timeline convergence at 7% and increasing. Michael could feel alternate versions of himself working alongside him, their actions synchronized across multiple realities. In some timelines, the installation process had different technical challenges. In others, the temporal agents had presented different arguments or revealed different information. But in all cases, the fundamental choice remained the same. The crystal matrix began responding to the installation process, creating harmonic resonances that spread throughout the facility and beyond. Michael could sense the temporal anchor system coming back online, stabilizing the local space-time structure and beginning to repair the fractures that Dr. Chen's extended presence had created. Convergence at 23%, the future agent reported. Timeline integration proceeding within acceptable parameters. As the convergence accelerated, Michael began experiencing entire lifetimes of memories from his alternate selves. He lived through the car accident that had killed one version of himself at age 23, felt the satisfaction of the forest ranger who had spent 40 years protecting wilderness areas, experienced the joy and heartbreak of the married version who had raised 3 children with Janet. This is the most difficult part, Dr. Chen warned. Your consciousness is integrating the experiences of hundreds of different lives. Many people lose their sense of identity during convergence. Michael held onto his core sense of self while allowing the alternate memories to flow through him. Each alternate life brought different perspectives and wisdom, but they all shared the same fundamental values and decision-making processes that had led him to this moment. The crystal installation reached its critical phase as convergence passed 50%. Michael was now working not just with his own hands, but with the coordinated actions of dozens of alternate selves, whose timelines were close enough to the prime configuration to maintain individual coherence. Convergence at 67%, Agent Morrison announced. Timeline stability increasing across all monitored sectors. Michael could feel the temporal fractures healing as the anchor system restored its stabilizing influence. The chaotic time distortions that had been spreading across the Pacific Northwest were beginning to resolve, and the cascade prediction models showed rapidly improving stability projections. As convergence approached 80%, Michael experienced the moment when the more divergent alternate timelines began collapsing into the prime configuration. The mining engineer, who had never gone to college, merged with the research geologist, who had spent his career studying seismic activity. The version who had died young integrated his unlived potential with the version who had lived to see retirement. Final crystal alignment in progress, Dr. Chen reported. Convergence at 91% and holding steady. Michael completed the crystal installation with hands that had performed this action across hundreds of timelines. The temporal anchor system came fully online with a harmonic resonance that he could feel in his bones, a deep musical note that seemed to align the fabric of space-time itself. Convergence complete, the future agent announced. Timeline integration successful. Temporal anchor restored to full operational status. Michael stood in the convergence chamber as the last of the alternate timelines merged with his own consciousness, bringing with them the full weight of hundreds of lives lived and choices made. The moment the final crystal locked into place, reality itself seemed to take a deep breath. Michael felt the timeline stabilizer engage throughout the facility, its influence spreading outward like ripples in a cosmic pond. The convergence process accelerated beyond the predictions. pulling timeline variants toward the prime configuration with increasing intensity. Standing in the convergence chamber, Michael experienced the overwhelming sensation of living hundreds of lives simultaneously. He was the cautious geologist who had always followed safety protocols, the risk-taking explorer who had pursued dangerous research, the family man who had prioritized relationships over career, and dozens of other variations of himself. In the most intense moment of convergence, Michael found himself face to face with the other versions of himself in the chamber. They appeared as translucent figures, each one representing a different path his life had taken. The mining engineer nodded with respect at the choice being made. The forest ranger placed a spectral hand on his shoulder in support. The married version of himself smiled sadly, understanding the sacrifice being made for the greater good. Timeline stabilization at 97%, Dr. Chen announced, her voice carrying across multiple realities as the convergence neared completion. Temporal anchor system responding within optimal parameters. The facility around them began to solidify as the alternate timelines collapsed into the prime configuration. Michael could feel the weight of the temporal agent's presence shifting as they too were affected by the convergence process. Agent Morrison and the future agent began to fade, their missions across alternate timelines becoming unnecessary as the multiple realities merged into one. But something unexpected was happening with Dr. Chen. Instead of stabilizing with the convergence, she was becoming more transparent, her form flickering between different temporal states. "The convergence is creating a paradox for me," she explained, struggling to maintain her coherence. "As your descendant from a timeline that now includes integrated memories from hundreds of alternates, my own temporal displacement becomes logically impossible." Michael realized that Dr. Chen's sacrifice was necessary for the convergence to complete successfully. Her presence from the future had been the catalyst for the entire crisis, and resolution required her return to her own time or her complete integration into the prime timeline. "I can stabilize in this time period," she said, reading his concern. "But it would mean abandoning my mission to return to 2157 and warning the temporal research teams about the convergence effects. Without that warning, they'll repeat the same mistakes that led to this crisis." The final moments of convergence brought Michael face to face with the ultimate test of his decision. The timeline stabilizer required a conscious choice about Dr. Chen's fate. He could lock her into the current timeline, ensuring her survival but preventing her from completing her warning mission to the future. Or he could allow her to attempt the dangerous return journey, risking her life, but potentially preventing future temporal crises. "What happens to the future if you don't return?" Michael asked, drawing on the integrated memories of his alternate selves to understand the long-term implications. "The temporal research program continues without understanding the convergence risks," Dr. Chen replied. "Within 50 years, they'll create an even larger crisis that could require convergence of entire civilizations rather than just individual timelines." Michael found himself experiencing memories from the version of himself who had become a temporal researcher in one of the alternate timelines. That Michael understood the mathematics of temporal displacement and the catastrophic potential of uncontrolled convergence events on a galactic scale. "You have to return," he decided. "The risk of future temporal catastrophes outweighs the certainty of your survival in this timeline." Dr. Chen nodded, her form already beginning to fade as the timeline stabilizer prepared to send her back to 2157. "The convergence process has given you access to knowledge and memories that will be crucial for monitoring this anchor site. You'll know when future temporal interference threatens the stability we've created here." As the convergence reached its final phase, Michael experienced one last moment of connection with all his alternate selves. The forest ranger's quiet wisdom, the mining engineer's practical problem-solving skills, the married man's understanding of love and loss, all of it integrated into his consciousness while maintaining his core identity. The timeline stabilizer completed its work with a harmonic resonance that seemed to align every atom in the facility. The alternate timelines collapsed completely into the prime configuration, and Michael found himself alone in the convergence chamber, carrying the memories and experiences of hundreds of lives while remaining fundamentally himself. Dr. Chen's final words echoed across the temporal barriers as she faded from the current timeline. Thank you for choosing the future over the past. Protect what we've built here. The silence that followed the convergence was profound, broken only by the gentle hum of the temporal anchor system operating at optimal efficiency. Michael stood alone in the convergence chamber, his consciousness now integrated with the experiences of hundreds of alternate lives, while the facility around him settled into its new, stable configuration. The Memory Integration Matrix, a sophisticated system built into the chamber's crystalline walls, began the delicate process of helping Michael organize and process the overwhelming influx of alternate memories. Instead of experiencing them as chaotic fragments, the Matrix allowed him to access specific memories and knowledge sets as needed while maintaining his core identity. Agent Morrison and the future agent had vanished with the completion of the convergence, their missions across multiple timelines no longer necessary. The temporal war that had raged across centuries was effectively ended, at least in this sector of space-time. The timeline stabilizer had created a configuration that all the competing factions could accept, eliminating the need for further conflict. Michael accessed memories from the version of himself who had become a temporal researcher, understanding now how the anchor network functioned and what his responsibilities would be going forward. The facility wasn't just a monitoring station, but an active management center for temporal stability across the entire Pacific Northwest region. As he made his way back through the facility's corridors, Michael noted how the spatial compression technology had stabilized along with the timelines. The impossible architecture that had seemed to bend and shift now felt solid and reliable. The equipment that had appeared alien and incomprehensible was now familiar, his integrated memories providing him with operational knowledge from multiple alternate lives. The control room displayed global temporal stability readings that showed the successful repair of the cascade failure. Timeline fractures that had been spreading across the continent were healing, and the other anchor sites were reporting restored stability. The immediate crisis was over, but Michael understood that his role as Guardian was just beginning. The integrated memories included experiences from versions of himself who had lived with knowledge of the temporal anchor system for decades. They had learned to balance the isolation that came with such responsibility against the satisfaction of protecting human civilization from temporal threats that most people would never know existed. Michael found himself thinking about Elena Kowalski, his neighbor who had helped him investigate the initial discovery. In one of the alternate timelines, she had become his closest confidant and eventually his wife. The memory of that relationship, though it belonged to a different version of himself, provided comfort and suggested possibilities for his future in this stabilized timeline. The facility's communication systems indicated that other anchor sites around the world were reporting successful resolution of their own temporal crises. The convergence process had created a global stabilization effect, ending the temporal war and establishing a new equilibrium that would allow human civilization to develop more safely. As Michael prepared to leave the facility and return to the surface, he reviewed the protocols that his alternate memories provided for maintaining security and continuing the monitoring mission. The facility would remain hidden beneath his property, accessible only to him, and responding to threats that required intervention. The Guardian's Manual, a comprehensive database built into the facility's computer systems, contained everything he would need to know about maintaining the temporal anchor and responding to future crises. The manual included contact protocols for reaching other anchor sites and emergency procedures for situations that might require coordinated response across the global network. Michael's understanding of his new role was comprehensive, thanks to the integrated memories from alternate versions of himself who had served as temporal guardians for decades. He knew how to recognize the signs of temporal interference, how to calibrate the anchor systems for optimal stability, and how to maintain the necessary secrecy while living a normal life on the surface. The most profound change was in his perspective on time itself. Where he had once seen his life as a linear progression from past to future, he now understood time as a complex web of possibilities that required careful tending. His decisions would continue to ripple through space-time, but now he had the knowledge and tools to make those decisions wisely. Before leaving the facility, Michael activated the systems that would monitor temporal stability while he was on the surface. The crystalline pendant that Dr. Chen had given him would allow him to communicate with the facility and respond quickly to any threats. As he climbed the stairs toward the surface, Michael carried with him the memories of hundreds of lives lived and the responsibility for protecting the timeline that they had all chosen to preserve. The weight of that responsibility was balanced by the knowledge that came from experiencing so many different perspectives on what it meant to make difficult choices for the greater good. Michael emerged from the facility into a world that looked identical to the one he had left, but which he now understood in fundamentally different ways. The morning sun cast the same golden light across his property, but he could sense the temporal currents flowing beneath the surface of normal reality. Stable and strong, thanks to the work they had completed below ground. The earthquake fissure in his backyard had sealed itself during the convergence process, leaving only a slight depression in the lawn to mark where the most important discovery of his life had begun. The facility's entrance hatch was now completely hidden, protected by temporal displacement fields that would make it invisible to anyone who wasn't authorized to access it. Elena Kowalski appeared at the fence line between their properties, carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who had been genuinely worried about her neighbor. "Michael, thank goodness you're all right. I saw some strange lights coming from your property last night and was concerned about aftershock damage." "Just some electrical problems from the earthquake," Michael replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Everything's been repaired now." As he talked with Elena, Michael found himself drawing on memories from the alternate timeline where they had developed a deeper relationship. The knowledge of that other life provided insight into her personality and interests that made their conversation flow more naturally than it ever had before. The Guardian's manual that now resided in his integrated memory included detailed protocols for maintaining a normal surface life while carrying out temporal guardian responsibilities. The key was to remain engaged with his community and maintain genuine relationships, using the enhanced perspective from his alternate memories to be a better neighbor and friend. Over the following days, Michael settled into his new existence with surprising ease. The integrated memories from hundreds of alternate lives provided him with a wealth of experience and wisdom that made everyday decisions simpler and more confident. He knew which choices led to better outcomes because he had lived through the alternatives. The facility beneath his property operated automatically, monitoring temporal stability across the region and alerting him only when his intervention was needed. The crystalline pendant around his neck served as a constant link to the anchor systems, providing reassurance that the timeline remained stable and secure. Michael's understanding of his role extended beyond simply maintaining the temporal anchor. The Guardian's manual included protocols for subtle interventions that could prevent future temporal crises before they began. Small actions, carefully timed, could guide events toward more stable configurations without disrupting the natural flow of cause and effect. The most significant change in his daily life was his relationship with time itself. Where he had once worried about aging and the passage of years, he now understood that his consciousness carried the experiences of lifetimes spanning different timelines. Death, when it eventually came, would simply be another transition rather than an ending. The knowledge that he was protecting human civilization from temporal threats that most people would never know existed provided a deep sense of purpose that had been missing from his retirement years. Every day spent maintaining the normal facade of his surface life was actually a day spent ensuring the continuity of human history itself. Michael found himself looking forward to the future with an anticipation that drew on memories from alternate timelines. Where he had lived decades longer, he knew that Elena's granddaughter would eventually become important in his life, leading to the genetic line that would produce Dr. Chen and the temporal displacement technology that had made their mission possible. The temporal anchor network continued to operate smoothly, with reports from other Guardian sites around the world indicating stable conditions and successful crisis resolution. The convergence process had created a new equilibrium that would allow human civilization to develop toward the eventual mastery of time travel without the warfare and chaos that had characterized the previous temporal conflicts. As weeks passed, Michael began to understand that his role as a temporal guardian was not just about protecting the past and present, but about nurturing the future that would grow from the choices made in this stabilized timeline. The responsibility was profound, but so was the satisfaction of knowing that his actions were ensuring the best possible outcomes for generations yet to come. Standing in his garden on a quiet evening, Michael looked up at the stars and reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The discovery beneath his yard had changed everything he thought he knew about reality, but it had also given him a purpose and understanding that made every moment of his existence meaningful. The Guardian's manual reminded him that vigilance was eternal, but so was hope.